Alvin Chi. I'm one of the primary care sports medicine physicians here at Children's Health Andrews Institute, and I will be practicing at the new location at Redbird Mall coming soon. So I'm excited today to talk to you about early sports specialization. This is a topic that is continuing to grow in relevance over the past several years, and this is especially relevant in the DFW area, just with us having a lot of elite youth athletes and sports continuing to grow in the Metroplex. So I have no financial disclosures or conflict of interest with the presentation materials. So just to give you a roadmap of the talk, I'm going to start out with talking about the introduction and epidemiology of youth sports, and then I'm going to go over the definition of early sports specialization. Then I'll talk about the current evidence that we have for or against early sports specialization, and then go over the position statements from the various medical societies and governing sports bodies. We'll talk about how to manage the specialized athlete, and then we'll talk about models for youth development. So why do we care about early sports specialization? So it's estimated that about 60 million children in the United States between 6 to 18 years of age participate in organized sports. And there's an increasing trend towards early sports specialization. So a recent poll of athletic directors throughout high schools in the United States found that a majority of them, so over 77%, report an increased trend in early sports specialization. And in particular, there is approximately 30% of young athletes who are specializing in only one sport. So sports in of themselves is good for health. So we know that sports has great mental, emotional, and social health benefits. So we know that it decreases depression, decreases anxiety, and improves overall cognitive function. We also know of the various physical health benefits, so increased bone mass, improved weight status, and improved cardiorespiratory fitness, and improved musculoskeletal health as well. So overall, sports is good for health, and this is one of the reasons why we promote it. However, with any beneficial thing, when we take it to the extreme, it becomes a more complex issue. So early sports specialization is becoming a public health issue. It's estimated that 10% of youth athletes and 20% of elite youth athletes drop out of sports due to injury. And the estimated cost of early sports specialization is about $5.2 billion per year in the US. So this is a growing public health issue that we are focusing more and more on. So with any issue, we want to, when it comes to addressing it, it's helpful to know the history. So what is the history of school sports in America? How did we get here? So with any historical event, there's definitely going to be multiple root causes. So it's definitely multifactorial. But one of the big things was in 1852, Massachusetts becomes the first state to make school compulsory. And by the early 20th century, the rest of the states in America followed suit. And so with school becoming compulsory, public health officials wanted to keep boys off the streets because they didn't trust boys in parks and playgrounds unsupervised. So the connection there between compulsory school and this concern is that with compulsory school, there is more free time after school. And so what is there to do with children after school with this new found free time? And the hope is that with sports, sports was seen to teach American values, so teamwork, hard work, and respect for authority. In addition, public officials were growing concerned because the United States were having children in school for longer hours than any other country in the world at that time. And so there was a growing concern that schooling, all this extra schooling, would make children soft and weak. And so sports was also seen as a way to protect masculinity and to also prevent children from being involved in various vices that you would find in the streets. So by 1903, New York City formed its first public school athletic league. And later on in the early 20th century, multiple cities across the United States followed suit. So with the Great Depression, school sports started to shut down, and pay-to-play organizations start to pop up, like Pop Warner and Little League Baseball. In addition, the first televised sporting event occurred in 1939, and as the years went on, advertisements on television made professional careers more lucrative. There was more of a financial incentive to play sports, in addition to collegiate scholarships. In addition to this, in the 1970s, 1980s, as the baby boomer population was going to college, there was a huge influx of college applications, and there needed to be a way for applicants to differentiate themselves. And one of the ways to do so was participation in school sports. So all these various factors came together to bring about the modern era of youth sports, where there became a commercialization of youth sports and a changing attitude of sports by parents. In addition to that, in the 1990s, Anders Ericsson, who is a Swedish psychologist and researcher on acquiring expertise, presented his 10,000 hour rule. And with his studies, he was looking at musicians in particular, and he found that in order to gain expertise, he noticed that there needed to be, on average, 10,000 hours over 10 years to become an expert in a skill. And he didn't extrapolate this per se to sports, but others extrapolated this to sports, even though his original research wasn't on sports. And there became this belief that you needed 10,000 hours acquired over a career to become really good at your specific sport. And so there became this growing focus of intense domain-specific practice, which was found to be believed to be advantageous for improving sports. And so parents started to have children participate in sports at an early age in the hopes that participating at an early age would put their kids at an increased advantage of getting a college scholarship or playing sports at the elite level. So when it comes to researching, it's important to have a definition. And early sports specialization is one of those things where we know it when we see it, but it's a little bit more difficult to actually define it. And so Neeru Jayanthi, who is arguably the world's leading expert on early youth sports specialization, he's done a ton of research, and I'll cite a lot of his work in this talk. He came up with this 3-element scale for early sports specialization. So his definition was the first element, focusing on one main sport, and 2, focusing on that one main sport at the exclusion of other sports, and then 3, participating in that sport year-round. And his definition of year-round was greater than 8 months per year. And so the helpful thing with having these 3 elements is you're able to grade the degree of specialization based on how many of these elements the athlete has. So you can grade it into low, moderate, and highly specialized. And you look at this chart from his research, he found that the higher the grade degree of specialization, the more likely the child was going to have risk for serious overuse injury and risk for overall injury. One interesting thing is that it hasn't been shown that early sports specialization has increased the risk of acute injury, but we know that most injuries that children face in sports is overuse injuries. So there was also a Delphi panel that was convened in 2021. And so the Delphi method is a process used to arrive at a group opinion based by surveying a panel of experts. So if there is any disagreement, they'll continue to do rounds of surveying and then discussion and then another round until the experts are able to agree upon a consensus. And so this Delphi panel also had a similar definition, and their definition was intentional and focused participation in a single sport for the majority of the year that restricts opportunities for engagement in other sports and activities. And it's important to note that there isn't an agreement on what is defined as early sports specialization, but most of the research cites less than 12 years of age as early as 12 years of age is the average age of puberty onset for both boys and girls, girls being between 8 to 13 years of age and boys being 9 to 14 years of age. So what are the risk factors for sports specialization? So Jayanthi in 2018 did a cohort study and surveyed over 1,000 athletes from 2010 to 2013 between the ages of 7 to 18 years of age. And what he found was that high socioeconomic status athletes reported more hours per week spent playing organized sports and trained more months per year in their main sport than their low socioeconomic counterparts. And so this is what he calls the more money, more problems issue. So in addition to high socioeconomic status being a risk factor, other research has shown that another risk factor is participating in individual sport as opposed to a team sport. So things like dance, gymnastics, or tennis are going to put you at increased risk for specializing at an early age. Another risk factor is being female. So we know that females are more likely than their male counterparts to participate in an individual sport. So the big concern with early sports specialization are overuse injuries. And so in the pediatric population, we see a unique variety of overuse injuries that our adult counterparts don't see. And so these include things like apophysitis or growth plate irritation diagnoses. So the most common one that is Osgood-Schlatter disease of the knee. But in addition to that, there are other apophysitis, apophyseal injuries as well. So Sever's apophysitis in the heel. In the hip, you have your avulsion fractures and your hip apophysitis. In the lumbar spine, you have spondylolysis, which we usually see later on than things like Osgood-Schlatter's and Sever's apophysitis. We also have things like Little League elbow and Little League shoulder. And then also in our gymnasts, we commonly see distal radial epiphysitis or gymnast wrist. So there was a meta-analysis that was done in 2018 looking at 5 studies that met inclusion criteria. And these studies ranged anywhere from 300 to 2,000 athletes. And what this meta-analysis showed with a recommendation grade B level is that sports specialization is associated with an increased risk of overuse musculoskeletal injuries. And athletes who were highly specialized using that Jayanthi definition were almost 2 times as likely to have an overuse injury than their low specialization counterparts. So there's this concern that early sports specialization puts you at increased risk for overuse injuries. But what about when it comes to performance-related outcomes? So this is a systematic review by Stephanie Clythermes in 2019, and she looked at 7 articles, so 7 research studies that looked at the effect of early sports specialization on specific motor tasks, including components of physical fitness and coordination. And so these are things like the long jump, things like the landing error scoring test, and the Y balance test. So just to explain those tests briefly, the Y balance test is when you're standing on one foot and you're trying to reach both in front of you and to the sides while standing on one foot and looking for asymmetries in your reach. And this has been shown to predict injury risk. And then also the landing error scoring test is looking at your postural assessment when you're standing on an elevated surface and then jumping down on both feet and then jumping up again off the ground and then landing back on both feet, looking for your doing a dynamic postural assessment, which is also associated with increased injury risk, depending on if your knee goes into valgus and various alignment deficits. And so looking at these 7 articles, what's been found is that youth sports specialization does not appear to improve task-related performance outcomes. And when differences were noted, multi-sport athletes tended to perform better than their single sport athletes in task-specific outcomes. So there's this concern that early sports specialization increases your risk of overuse injuries. The research doesn't seem to show that it improves early sports specialization improves task-related performance outcomes. What about early sports specialization in your chances of performing at elite levels, such as becoming a Division I collegiate athlete? So this is something that was looked at in 2017. So this is a cross-sectional study. And the purpose of the study was to characterize Division I athletes' prior sports participation. And so they looked at over 1,000 athletes, NCAA Division I athletes from 3 Midwestern universities. And what they found was that most athletes participated in 2 or more sports during their senior year, compared to athletes who only participated in 1 sport. In addition to that, the athletes who did participate in only 1 sport, which was the minority, their average age of specialization was 12.5 years of age. Similarly, there's been other studies done on various other sports, including wrestling, soccer, hockey, swimming, basketball, across multiple countries. And it hasn't been shown that athletes who specialized early on were more likely to participate at an elite level than their multi-sport or late specialization counterparts. In addition to that, one caveat I want to make is that it seems to be that with sports like rhythmic gymnastics or diving or figure skating, where there is a peak performance prior to full maturation, those individuals were more likely to specialize at an early age, those who participated at elite level. But outside of those, the rest of the sports, there hasn't been shown to be an increased likelihood of reaching elite status by specializing early. So just to summarize the current evidence, so early sports specialization is not necessary for reaching an elite level. Elite athletes tend to specialize later than their non-elite or semi-elite peers, and youth sports specialization has not been shown to improve task-related performance outcomes. In addition, there's almost a 2 times greater risk for overuse injuries and increased risk for serious overuse injuries like high-risk stress fractures in those who specialize early in sports. Anytime we talk about evidence, you want to talk about the limitations of the evidence as well. In particular, some of the limitations cited by the systematic reviews include needing more sport-specific research. So we don't want to necessarily paint a broad brush for all sports if we haven't done research on that specific sport by itself. In addition, we want more prospective research studies, so it's more difficult to establish causality in retrospective studies. In addition to that, we want to control for specific variables such as training load. So for example, if we have an individual who specializes early and only participates in 1 sport, comparing that to an individual who participates in multiple sports, we want to make sure that they're both participating in the same amount of hours of practice and competition before we say for sure that it's from the early sports specialization that they're at increased risk for overuse injuries. So I wanted to go over as well this 2019 Early Youth Sports Specialization Summit paper that has a good collection of all the various medical governing bodies as well as sport governing bodies recommendations on early sports specialization. So just going over the first column on position on early sports specialization, and this is including the American Academy of Pediatrics, so the columns, American Academy of Pediatrics, the American Medical Society for Sports Medicine, the American Orthopedic Society for Sports Medicine, and including the IOC and the NATA and also the NSCA. So if we look at early sports specialization, it's discouraged across the board. The only caveat being the IOC provided a more nuanced position saying that it can be acceptable if there's a broad range of biomechanical exposures, and also that there's a good balance of sports and in life. And in terms of the risk factors are pretty similar to what we talked about previously, the concern across the board are increased risk for injuries and increased risk for stress and burnout. And in terms of the benefits of early diversified training, where you're participating in multiple sports, is that you're more likely to participate in physical activity and sports throughout your lifetime, and you're more likely to achieve an elite status compared to those who specialize at an early age. In terms of when it was appropriate to specialize in sports, about over half didn't have a defined age, but the ones who did comment said late adolescence, so somewhere between 15 to 16 years of age. And then in terms of important exceptions to these recommendations, multiple medical societies stated that things like figure skating, gymnastics, and diving, because peak performance may occur before full maturation, are important exceptions to their recommendations. And then they provided additional recommendations as well in the last row. So just to summarize the position statements, there's a delay in sport specialization until late adolescence is what is recommended. It's important to monitor training loads in regards to the athlete's maturation level. So 9 months or less per year of organized sports participation. Prior to adolescence, there's an encouragement for early sports sampling, so participating in multiple sports and focusing on neuromuscular development. And we'll talk about that more in the later slides. And then also monitoring for signs of burnout and overtraining syndrome. So next, I want to talk about what to do for the specialized athlete. We can have these recommendations, but even with these recommendations, there are still a lot of young athletes who are specializing at an early age. So what are some practical tips that we can give them? So I really like this infographic by Yann Lemur, who is a French sports scientist. He created this infographic from summarizing Jayanthi and Dugas's 2017 article on injury prevention in youth athletes. So the first thing in this article is really focusing on a good preseason conditioning. And a good example of what happens when this doesn't occur is what we see here in the primary care sports medicine clinic during the fall and the spring, when athletes go into cross country or go into track and field, and they weren't conditioning prior to that. Is about 1 month into the season, we see a lot of people coming in with stress fractures or medial tibial stress syndrome. The next thing that's really important is having at least 1 day off per week, and as well having 3 months off per year from organized sports. And those 3 months don't have to be consecutive months. And the big concern there, if children are participating in sports 7 days a week, longer than 8 months per year, is just increased risk for burnout. The other thing as well is really looking at the amount of time athletes are spending in organized sports versus time spent in free play. So free play would be things like playing at a park or playing pickup basketball with friends. So there is a concern that if the ratio of hours spent in organized sports compared to hours spent in free play is greater than or equal to 2 to 1, then there's a concern for increased risk for injury. And probably the easiest rule of thumb to remember to share with your athletes in clinic is the amount of hours they spend per week on organized sports, whether that be organized practice or competition, should be equal to or less than their year of age. So if you're 12 years old, you shouldn't be spending more than 12 hours per week in organized sports. So one important thing we also want to recommend to our specialized athletes and athletes in general is integrative neuromuscular training. And so in the era of technology, social media, and COVID, there's been an increase in a sedentary lifestyle, and we can't assume that children going into sports have the same amount of motor skills, muscular fitness, and physical literacy. And so with early specialized athletes, they exhibit on average a less diverse movement capacity and movement profile compared to their multi-sport counterparts. And this is concerning because athletes who don't have a wide array of developed neuromuscular patterns are more likely to be injured. So what is integrative neuromuscular training? So there's the easiest definition I've heard is neuromuscular training is teaching the nerves and muscles how to talk to each other in a way that optimizes performance and decreases risk of injury. And so unlike conventional strength training, neuromuscular exercises address the quality of movement and emphasizes joint control in all three movement planes. And so the goal of INT is to promote development of these neurocognitive processes and visual motor abilities. And the table on the right is just a sample example of integrative neuromuscular training. And it doesn't have to take long. It can just be 15 minutes before practice, but it's been shown that INT helps to improve sports performance and decrease the risk of injury. Another hot topic is load management, and this is something that has garnered public attention, especially in the NBA over the past 10 years. And load management is the practice of controlling extrinsic loads, and what an extrinsic load or external load is external stimulus applied to the athlete that is measured independently of their internal characteristics or resilience. And so an easy example of external load would be things like distances run, pitches pitched, training or competition time, and also the acute on chronic load ratio. And so the concern is that when athletes participate in competition more than in training, this has been shown to increase your risk of injury. And it's believed that when you spend more time in competition than in training, athletes aren't spending the adequate amount of time to prepare their physical capacities for competition. So one important thing I wanted to talk about with load management is acute on chronic workload ratio. And so Tim Gabbett, who is really the world's leading expert on load management, this is a chart that is from his article in 2017. And an example of acute and chronic workload ratio is, let's say that you are a runner. And so to calculate your acute workload, you would take the amount of miles you would run in the past 7 days. So let's say you run 2 miles per day, each day for 7 days. So that'll be 14 miles per week. And then let's calculate your chronic workload. And so that would be the prior month. So prior to those 7 days, you would look at your average miles per week. And so let's say you ran 1 mile per week each week for the past month prior to those 7 days. So that would be 7 miles per week. So you would take the acute, which would be 14 miles, over the chronic, which would be 7 miles, and you would get the number 2. And so really what this chart is showing is the farther away you are from 1, so having a pretty consistent balance between your acute and your chronic workload, the increased risk for injury. And depending on the sport you are in, it can be difficult to calculate your acute and your chronic workloads. But I think the principle is the most important thing to take away, which is that when you have acute spikes in your workload, so if you are a cross-country runner and you haven't been working out entire summer and then you go straight into your season, your acute over your chronic workload ratio is going to spike significantly and increase your risk for injury. Another important thing to evaluate in athletes, and especially your specialized athletes, are psychosocial protective factors. So an important thing is looking at their environment they're in. So if they're in an environment that's very outcomes driven and outcomes based, that's going to increase their risk for burnout and poor quality of life. And so a better thing to focus on rather than whether you win or lose, which may not be entirely in your control, are short-term goals such as skill development and things like that that are in the control of the athlete, rather than looking at things like wins or losses. Another important protective factor is the autonomy of the athlete. So is it the athlete themselves who are driven and wanting to specialize at an early age, or is it the parents or the coaches? And if it's driven by parents and coaches, there is an additional risk for stress and burnout and things like that. In addition, an important thing to look at is the identity of the athlete. So is the athlete's identity completely in their sport? They see themselves as an athlete first and nothing else. That's going to put them at increased risk as well. And then finally, I know it sounds simple, but adequate sleep is also extremely important. We know that athletes and children in general, on average, are not getting enough sleep, and that puts them at increased risk for just poor mental health and not enough time for physical recovery as well. Just want to quickly show some of the signs of burnout. So the technical term or the medical term for burnout is overtraining syndrome. And that's a condition in which athletes experience fatigue and declining performance in sport despite increased training. So if you have an athlete who's training all the time and they're extremely irritable or agitated, or they're excessively tired all the time and their performance is suffering despite training more, these are all signs of burnout and needing to decrease the workload on the patient. So next, I want to go over some of the alternative athlete developmental models. So what we've been focusing on so far in the talk is just early sport specialization, but what are some alternatives for that? And before we talk about that, I want to go over just a couple quick studies. So in 2015, there was a survey of over 496 college students, and then also so alumni as well. So both alumni and alumni of alumni who used to play Division I sports, and then also current Division I athletes, and also students who are not athletes. And what they found, and what's really important, is that they didn't find a significant difference between alumni student athletes and alumni non-athletes in the amount of physical activity they're participating in per week, which is important because one of the ultimate goals in sports participation is that children will learn to love physical activity and exercise and want to continue that to stay healthy even long after they're an athlete. So that's one of the things that we want to have in a model for athlete development, is just whether they continue to participate in exercise after their career is over. Another study that's also helpful to look at is this 2017 study where they had over 756 participants, and they looked at between the ages of 10 and 11, and they had these 10 to 11-year-olds participate in a questionnaire every 4 months over 5 years. They would group these participants in those with early sports specialization, those who don't participate in sports, and those who were able to sample a variety of sports. And what they found is that compared with early sports specialization and non-participation, early sports sampling in childhood was associated with a higher likelihood of recreational participation. And so one of the big goals in these various developed models is how we can have children not drop out of sports and continue to participate in physical activity after their participation in sports. So the first model I want to talk about is the developmental model of sports participation, or the DMSP. And the DMSP is the first one I talk about because it's the easiest to remember. It just has 3 phases. And it's highlighted in this box in the middle. So the first phase is early sports sampling. So the athlete takes part in multiple sports activities and develop all-around foundational movement skills at an early age. And if they want, they can specialize in the specialization phase, and the athlete begins to focus on fewer sports and possibly focusing in one particular sport. And this is something that they do no later than age 12. And then the investment phase is when athletes commit to achieving a high level of performance in that specific sport. So that's the model that's easiest to remember. And the next model I'm going to show, the LTAD model, or the long-term athlete development model, has a similar principle as well, but it has more phases. And so this model was developed by Dr. Balyi in 1998 in Canada. And the LTAD model was designed to aid the progression of young participants from active children into elite athletes. And so he originally presented 3 phases, but over the years, he's had several iterations and now has 7 phases in his model. And the goal was really to counter the detrimental effects that he saw in early sports specialization. And this model hopes to offer a positive framework to develop physical literacy by allowing kids to be confident in movements at an early age. So looking at the 7 phases, the first 3 phases, the active start, the fundamentals phase, and the learn to train phase, all are grouped into this stage called physical literacy. And so the goal during these stages is to master basic human movements, fundamental movement skills, and foundational sports. And so the first stage is the active start stage, which is between the ages of 0 and 6. And the goal of this is just to promote multiple active daily sessions. And the goal is just to not be sedentary for more than 1 hour at a time while awake, and to encourage discovery and exploring surroundings, and to encourage creativity. The next phase is the fundamentals phase, and fun is highlighted with the goal of really stressing that this stage should be fun, and to begin teaching basic skills such as agility, balance, and coordination by using fun games. The next stage is the train to train stage, and the train to train stage is between the ages of about 8 to 12. And this is when you start to develop general sports skills and to introduce appropriate weight training. And then the train to compete stage is where you start sports specialization. And this is towards end of adolescence. And you want to continue to develop specific qualities for specific sports and events. And then the train to win stage is where you maximize your specific sports qualities and to further develop technical, tactical skills and things like that. The final stage is the active for life stage, and you can enter this at any age, and the goal is to enjoy sports or a healthy and fit lifestyle. So I really like this next diagram because it shows the ultimate goal of the LTAD model, which is that regardless of which pathway you take, you end up in the fit for life stage. And it's really important to emphasize that you don't need to go through the other stages like the train to train or the train to compete stage. You can just go straight from the fundamental stage and the learn to train stage to the fit for life stage. You don't necessarily have to compete at all. And you can go back and forth later on in life if you want to participate in like things like marathons or triathlons. You can go to a competitive for life or back to the fit for life stage. But the ultimate goal of the LTAD model is to prevent burnout and dropout and help kids be active for the rest of their life. The last model I want to talk about is the youth physical development model, which was introduced by Rodri Lloyd, who's a professor in pediatric strength and conditioning in the UK, and John Oliver, who is a professor in applied pediatric exercise science. And while they agreed with some of the principles of the LTAD, they wanted to address some of the deficiencies that they saw as well with that model. And one of the big things that they were critiquing is that periods were classified based on chronological age, but didn't take into account differing rates of maturation. And so for them, with their model, they're focusing more on when the kid enters their peak height velocity rather than a specific age. In addition, they thought that most fitness components are trainable throughout childhood and didn't need to be restricted to specific windows of development. So this is the model that they have for male athletes. And one of the big things they wanted to have is an easier user experience. So texts that have larger fonts and also texts that or the big thing is the highlighted, the enlarged font means that it's something that should be focused on at that stage. And the highlighted areas are the areas where there is peak height velocity. You can see that the areas, there's general span of age, but the thing that they're focusing on is when the child is going through their adolescent growth spurt or their peak height velocity. And so you can see that with something like strength training, for example, that's something that's focused on at the entire stage of the youth physical development. And because in particular, they believe that strength training should take place at all times, as long as there is a qualified coach. And this is important because it highlights that there isn't any evidence that strength training prior to puberty hurts things like growth plates, and that strength training is beneficial even in the pre-pubertal years when you don't have hypertrophy necessarily with strength training, but rather you have neural adaptations, which are beneficial for the athlete and helps prevent injury. And we do know that the evidence shows that strength training helps to develop not only muscle, but also speed, power, agility, and helps all these other skills that are trying to be developed. So this is the female chart, which is essentially the same diagram, but everything that's highlighted is shifted 2 years to the left, because on average, girls go through puberty 2 years earlier than boys do. And again, with the important thing about stressing things like strength throughout childhood is that it decreases the risk for osteoporotic fractures, particularly in females. So I just want to go over some of the areas for future research and some of the theoretical models that have been proposed. So Neeru Gianthi in 2021 developed a theoretical risk stratification model for specialized youth athletes. And so this is something that might not necessarily be ready for prime time now, but is something that may be helpful in the future for how you categorize the various pediatric athletes that you treat. So Gianthi and Gavitt both classified youth athletes into 3 main categories. So there's a load tolerant athlete who is skeletally mature or previously exposed to a high training load. Next category is the load naive athletes. So these are athletes who are skeletally immature and or have not been exposed to higher or specialized training loads. And then finally, you have the load sensitive athlete who, regardless of whether they're skeletally mature or immature, have experienced injury or recurrent injury related to training load progressions. So this model uses the floor to ceiling concept, with the floor being representing the athlete's current capacity and the ceiling representing the potential capacity to perform without injury. And so what we see first with the load tolerant athlete is they have a specific floor, and then you continue to train and progress them, and they're able to continue to increase their ceiling without injury. The next athlete is the load naive athlete, and so they have a specific floor. You expose them to increased training loads, and then they have an injury, and so you drop the floor, and then you more slowly increase their ceiling, and then they're able to slowly increase their capacity for work. The last athlete is this load sensitive athlete. So this is an athlete who they start at a specific floor, and you try to increase their ceiling, and they have an injury, so you try to increase their work capacity more slowly, and they continue to have an injury. And this is a patient where you either have to increase their workload even more slowly, or you may need to choose another pathway where they don't participate necessarily in competitive sports, but more recreationally. And so this is helpful because we're able to use these 3 categories and be able to develop specific recommendations for them. So for the low risk athlete or the low tolerant athlete, these are athletes who don't have injury. Their workload hours per week are less than their age. So some of these recommendations are things that we talked about previously. Their sports training ratio is less than 2 to 1. So these are athletes that you can continue training and competing toward optimum workload and may not need to be monitored as frequently. And then you have your moderate risk, so your low naive and your load sensitive athletes who, using the same criteria above, they're at increased risk. So their acute on chronic workload ratio is greater than 1.5 or greater than 2, or their competition to training ratio is greater than 1:1. So these are athletes that you may have to increase their workload more slowly, or you may have to monitor them more closely and have them follow up in the clinic more frequently. So similarly, another future area of research is biologic maturation. So we know that adolescent growth spurts occur at a time when there's increased risk for growth plate and overuse injuries. And so there's this hope that with looking at the percentage of predicted adult height, or the PPAH, we're able to predict when an athlete's at increased risk for overuse injury and at increased risk for specific injuries. So for example, we know that when the athlete's percentage of predicted adult height is about 89%, that's generally the time period that they're going to be more likely to have things like Osgood-Schlatter disease. And then prior to that, at 85% of PPAH, they're more likely to have something like Seaver's disease. And when they're close to maturity at 96% of PPAH, they're more likely to have stress fracture of the back or spondylolysis. And so the pattern that we tend to see is, as the athlete matures, while they're still in the pediatric years, growth plate injuries occur more from distally and then starts to move more proximally. So this is just a chart looking at the hope that we're able to predict the risk for injury based on biologic maturation. So depending on where the athlete's at with years from peak height velocity, so anywhere between 3 years to half a year of years from peak height velocity, they're more likely to have specific injuries than those when they're at their peak height velocity or when they're past their peak height velocity. And through that, the hope is that we're able to adjust their workload and adjust specific focuses on training so that we can prevent their injuries. And so there are some researchers who have already done this. And so biobanding is the term used and was coined by Ajax football club movement scientist from the Netherlands. And so what they did was they had athletes assigned to specific conditioning programs, not based on their age, but based on their stage of maturation. And they were able to find a reduced risk for overuse injuries when they categorized athletes based on their maturation rather than just simply on their age. And so this is something that in the future we're hoping that we're able to do, and not just look at the athlete's age, but really look at other markers and be able to track their peak height velocity and hopefully be able to adjust their workload from that. So in regards to future research, really there are several areas, and it's similar to what we talked about previously when we were summarizing the limitations to the evidence. We want to have an established definition for early youth sports specialization. We want to have a definition that's agreed upon so that the research is generalizable across various studies. We want more prospective studies because these are overall stronger studies and studies that we can be more certain about with our conclusions. We want studies that count for training loads, so we know that we can isolate and decrease confounding variables and be able to say that the various negative outcomes that we see in early sports specialization is from early sports specialization, not from various other things like hours spent in training. And then we want to perform research that spans the maturation of the entire athlete and not just in a specific phase in their maturation. And then finally, research isn't useful unless the boots on the ground, so coaches, athletic trainers, and parents know about the findings on our research and are able to adjust sports participation and training accordingly. So just in summary, early sports specialization, we want you guys to know what early sports specialization is. It's something that's easy to see, but not necessarily know exactly and be able to put it into words. So early sports specialization is a focus on one main sport, usually at the exclusion of other sports for the majority of the year. The vast majority of position statements, whether from medical societies or sports governing bodies, do not recommend early sports specialization based on the current evidence and expert opinion. And an important caveat to that would be things like diving, gymnastics, and figure skating. Helpful rule of thumb for you to share in the clinic is that your hours per week of participation in an organized sport should not be greater than your years in age, and to take at least 3 months off per year. Doesn't have to be consecutive months from organized sport, and at least 1 day off per week from organized sports. It's important to understand the various developmental models of sports participation and really stress the importance of early sports sampling to decrease the risk of burnout and decrease the risk of dropout. For the specialized athlete, it's important to incorporate neuromuscular training, have diverse muscular training, have strength and resistance training as well, and to pay attention to load management. It's something probably more likely in the future, but it can be helpful to classify athletes based on biological maturation when you pay attention to the workload of the patient and adjust their training plans. And then in terms of evaluating psychosocial factors, it's important to promote resilience in your athletes and pay attention to things like whether their environment is based on outcomes, whether they're getting enough sleep, and whether their self-conceptualization of themselves is based on only one thing, it's only based on sports. And these are my references. And just want to thank you for listening and tuning in to this continuing education talk. And if you have any questions, my email is listed below. I'm happy to answer any questions and just appreciate your time.